Hey, welcome back. If you are new here, I'm glad you found your way to this strange little corner of the internet, and if you've been here before, well, you already know what this is, and I'm genuinely happy you came back for more. Tonight we're talking about something most people never think to ask about when they picture the Colosseum, which is what it was actually like to be a woman there. Not a gladiator, not an emperor, but the wives and daughters and freed women who filled that building every single time its gates opened. Before we get into it, here is the only thing I will ever ask of you. If a video like this is the kind of thing you want more of, a like or a subscribe helps more than you might think, and it costs you absolutely nothing. What I would actually love is to know where you are tonight. Maybe you're lying in bed somewhere in Ohio. Maybe you're in a flat in London with the heating just barely doing its job. Maybe you're somewhere in Sydney, where it is already tomorrow morning and you still cannot sleep. All right, let us get you settled. Turn the lights down low and let your body go heavy against the mattress. It is not the sand you should picture first. Forget the sand. Forget the lions. Forget the roar that everyone imagines the moment they hear the word Colosseum. Picture instead a small room, 2 hours before any of that begins, where a woman sits perfectly still on a low wooden stool while another woman, who's not free to leave, pulls a bone pin through her hair hard enough to make her wince. Maybe she is the wife of a man who sits on the city council and owns 3 apartment buildings he has never once visited. Maybe she's younger than that, recently married, still learning which of her husband's friends she's allowed to speak to directly, and which ones she's only supposed to smile at from a distance. Maybe she's older, a widow now, attending today mostly because her daughter insisted, and because staying home alone again felt heavier than the thought of the crowd. Whoever she is, here is the strange truth that nobody mentions when they talk about Rome's most famous building. She's about to travel across the city in a litter carried by other human beings, wearing jewellery worth more than most of those carriers will earn across their entire lives, to sit in the one place in the whole city where her money, her husband's title, and her family's good name will buy her almost nothing at all. That is the part of this story most people never get. We will come back to it. Stay with me, because it is worth the wait. Let us call her Valeria, though that was a common enough name in Rome that there were probably a few hundred women answering to it on any given morning. It is the year 83, give or take. Domitian sits on the throne now, the younger of the 2 sons who followed Vespasian, a man who likes order, likes rules, likes things written down and enforced, and who, as we'll see, took a particular and very personal interest in exactly where women were allowed to sit. The Flavian Amphitheatre, which most of us know by a name nobody in Rome actually used, the Colosseum, has been standing for roughly 3 years. It was finished under his brother Titus, who flooded its floor with water for naval battles in the opening weeks, and then died of a fever before anyone really had time to get used to having it there. Domitian added the upper tier. He liked to finish things his brother started and then quietly make them his own. It is still dark outside Valeria's window. Somewhere below, in the street, a cart loaded with vegetables is making its slow, grinding way toward the markets, and the iron-rimmed wheels on stone are loud enough that she's already half awake before her own household begins to stir. Rome at this hour smells like bread starting to bake, like the cold ash of last night's cooking fires, and underneath all of it, faintly, permanently, like the open sewer that runs not far from every street in the city no matter how wealthy the address. You get used to it. Everyone did. That is one of those details that never makes it into the marble version of Rome we carry around in our heads, the version with gleaming columns and perfect togas. The real city smelled like a city. A loud, crowded, breathing, slightly rotten city of more than 1 million people. Valeria's husband is already gone, off to attend his patron at the morning salutatio, that strange daily ritual where lower status men lined up at the homes of wealthier, more powerful men simply to say good morning and be seen doing it. It tells you something about how thoroughly status structured every single hour of a Roman day, even the most ordinary ones. He will not be home until well into the afternoon. Today is a games day, and games days in Rome were not quiet, modest little outings. They were public holidays in the truest sense, days when the courts closed, when shops along certain streets shuttered early, when half the population of the city seemed to be moving in the same direction at once, toward the same enormous oval building on the low ground between the Palatine and the Esquiline Hills. She does not get to walk there with him, by the way. Husbands and wives did not attend together the way a modern couple might walk into a stadium side by side, find their seats, share a box of something salty, and watch the game together. We will get to exactly why in a moment, and it is, I promise, one of the more quietly infuriating details in this entire story. For now, all you need to know is that her day starts hours before his ends, because getting ready, for a woman of her standing, was its own kind of labour, performed almost entirely by other women who had no say in whether they wanted to be doing it. A slave girl, maybe 13, maybe a little older, it is genuinely hard to know with the sources we have, slips into the room carrying a small clay lamp, its flame trembling against the dark plaster walls. She sets out water in a shallow bronze basin. She does not speak unless spoken to first. This is the ornatrix in training, the future hairdresser, and right now her only job is to wake the mistress of the house gently enough that no one starts the day already irritated. Here is something worth sitting with for a second. The word ornatrix comes from the same root as our word ornament, and that is not an accident. These women, almost always enslaved, were literally human decoration tools, valued, bought, and sold partly for their skill at making someone else beautiful. Some of them became genuinely prized possessions, passed down in wills, mentioned by name in letters, occasionally even freed later in life as a reward for decades of careful, skilled, physically demanding work. Others were treated with a casual cruelty that the Roman poet Ovid himself found worth writing about. He describes, in one of his poems on women's beauty routines, a mistress who grabs pins from a hairdresser's hand and stabs her in the arm or scalp with them when a curl falls wrong. He's not writing this as outrage, particularly. He is writing it almost as an aside, a known thing, the sort of detail you mention in passing because everyone already understands it happens. That tells you something too, the way certain forms of cruelty become so ordinary that even the people writing poetry about beauty barely pause on them. Valeria is not, as far as we know, a woman who throws pins. Let us be a little generous with her. But the hair itself is still an enormous undertaking, and this is where Rome of the 80s gets genuinely interesting, because the fashion of this exact decade is one of the most dramatic hairstyles in the entire ancient world. Picture a tall, rounded crown of curls, built up and up above the forehead like a small architectural feature, tier after tier of tight ringlets, often held in place with a wire or reed frame underneath that nobody could see, with the actual hair only forming the surface of something much larger and more constructed than it looks. This was the Flavian style, and it required either an extraordinary natural head of hair, hours of curling with heated bronze rods, or, very often, both real hair and someone else's hair worked in together. That last part surprises people every time I mention it. Hairpieces and wigs were everywhere in Flavian Rome, and not in some shameful hidden way either. Blonde hair specifically was prized, partly because it was rare among Roman women, and partly because of where it tended to come from. German and Gallic captives, women taken in the wars on the northern frontier, were a known source of pale hair that ended up quite literally on the heads of Roman matrons attending the games to watch, among other things, men fighting men from those very same conquered territories. I find that detail almost unbearably strange when I actually let myself think about it. The hair of the conquered, styled into towers on the heads of the conquerors, worn to a building built partly with the wealth and the captives of conquest itself. Nobody walking into the amphitheatre that morning would have thought about it in those terms. To them it was simply fashion. To us, looking back, it is something closer to an accident of history that reveals more than anyone intended. The girl works a heated iron rod through sections of Valeria's hair, the smell of slightly singed hair oil mixing with whatever perfume already clings to the room. There is a particular ache that comes from sitting still for this long, head tilted at someone else's instruction, and Valeria has long since learned to let her mind wander elsewhere while it happens. Some women read scrolls during this time, some dictate letters, Some simply stare at the wall and think about nothing at all, which might honestly be the most honest description of meditation available to a Roman housewife in the year 83. Now the face. Roman cosmetics of this period were, to put it gently, not kind to the body in the long run, though nobody understood that yet. The foundation of choice for women who could afford it was a substance called cerussa, a white lead-based paste mixed with vinegar, applied across the face and neck to achieve the pale, luminous look that signaled a woman did not labor outdoors, did not have to, and never would. Pale skin was wealth made visible. A suntanned face meant field work or trade, or at the very least a life lived without the luxury of staying indoors. Cerussa gave you that paleness instantly, beautifully, and slowly. Over years of repeated use, it poisoned you. Lead absorbs through skin. It accumulates. Roman physicians had no real framework for understanding what was happening to women who used it for decades. The headaches, the tremors, sometimes worse. And so the cause and the symptom simply lived in separate boxes in everyone's mind. A woman who grew strange and shaky in her later years was thought to be sickly or cursed or simply unlucky, never connected back to the white paste she had been carefully applying to her face every morning since she was perhaps 16 years old. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. We tend to look at ancient beauty rituals and feel a kind of comfortable distance, as though we have moved past anything so dangerous. And then you remember that women in the 19th century were still using arsenic to whiten their skin, and that certain modern skin lightening creams sold today in parts of the world still contain mercury at levels that would alarm any toxicologist. The instinct itself, pale equals privileged, never quite goes away. It just changes its chemistry. Over the cerussa, Valeria's maid works in a touch of colour at the cheeks, often made from red ochre or crushed mulberries, sometimes from a substance called fucus, a dye also used, somewhat less glamorously, to colour wool and leather. For the lips, something similar, applied with a small brush or simply a fingertip. For the eyes, kohl made from soot or antimony, darkened along the lash line and sometimes extended slightly outward, with the eyebrows themselves often darkened to nearly meet in the middle, since a single continuous brow line was, for reasons that have not survived in any text that explains them clearly, considered a mark of real beauty in this period. We can guess at why. A strong, unbroken brow reads as serious, composed, dignified, the visual opposite of looking startled or overly emotional, which fits rather neatly with everything else Roman culture valued in its women. Calm, controlled, composed for public viewing. Perfume comes last, and this is where a wealthy household genuinely shows itself. Valeria's small collection of scent bottles, delicate glass vessels no taller than a finger, sit on a tray near the basin, each one holding something different. Myrrh, heavy and warm. Balsam, sweeter and lighter. A rose-based oil imported at considerable expense from somewhere in the eastern provinces, possibly Campania, possibly further, since the perfume trade routes of this era stretched all the way to Arabia and beyond for the rawest ingredients. Perfume was not a small luxury in Rome. Pliny the Elder, writing not long after this exact period, complains at length about the staggering sums wealthy Romans spent importing scent, treating it almost as a moral failing, a sign of the empire's softening under its own success. He has a point in a sense, though I suspect he would have worn perfume himself given half a reason to. The clothing comes next, and there is more structure to it than people usually assume when they picture a toga draped loosely over one shoulder. That image, the flowing toga, belongs almost entirely to men. A Roman matron of Valeria's standing would never wear a toga at all. Her base layer is a long tunic, simple linen against the skin, and over that comes the stola, the long sleeveless garment that fell in soft vertical folds from shoulder to ankle, traditionally fastened at the shoulders with small brooches called fibulae. The stola was specifically, almost legally, a marker of married status. A respectable Roman wife wore it the way a wedding ring functions today, a visible, immediately readable signal to anyone on the street. Over all of that, finally, the palla, a large rectangular wrap of wool or fine linen that could be draped across the shoulders, pulled up over the head when modesty or weather required it, or wrapped close against the body in colder months. Colour mattered enormously, and not in a casual fashion sense. Dye was expensive, some dyes catastrophically so, and certain colours carried meaning that everyone in Rome simply understood without needing it explained. Purple, the deep, almost bloody shade made from the murex sea snail, found along the coasts of Phoenicia and parts of North Africa, was so costly that producing a single pound of dye required, by some ancient estimates, the crushed shells of well over 10,000 snails. The full purple garment, dyed entirely in this colour rather than simply trimmed with a stripe of it, was a fortune worn on the body, and was for a long stretch of Roman history restricted by law to magistrates, senators, and the imperial family specifically. A wealthy woman like Valeria might own a stola trimmed with a band of purple at the hem, a tasteful suggestion of what her household could afford, without quite crossing into the kind of display that invited gossip, or worse, the attention of a sumptuary law. And there were sumptuary laws. This surprises people, the idea that Rome at various points in its history actually passed legislation specifically restricting how much gold, how much purple, how many ounces of jewellery a woman was permitted to wear in public. The most famous of these, the Lex Oppia, was passed during the dark, frightened years of the war against Hannibal, when Rome genuinely feared it might cease to exist, and it limited women to less than half an ounce of gold, banned brightly coloured clothing, and forbade riding in carriages within the city except for religious festivals. The law stayed on the books for roughly 20 years after the actual military emergency had passed, and when a push finally came to repeal it, the historian Livy describes Roman matrons literally filling the streets and blocking the entrances to the Forum, refusing to let the consuls pass, demanding the right to wear their own gold again. It worked. The law was repealed. I bring this up because it tells you something true about Roman women that the marble statues never quite capture. They were not passive. When something mattered enough, they organized, they showed up in numbers, and they made themselves impossible to ignore. By Valeria's time, more than 2 centuries later, the worst of the sumptuary restrictions have long since faded, replaced by the simpler, older logic that wealth itself was the only real restriction. If you could afford it, you generally wore it. Now the jewellery comes out. Earrings first, pearls if the household can manage it, since pearls held a particular obsession in Roman high society that bordered on genuine mania. Pliny tells a story, almost certainly exaggerated but revealing all the same, about a woman named Lolia Paulina who briefly married the Emperor Caligula, appearing at an ordinary, unremarkable banquet wearing emeralds and pearls covering her head, hair, ears, neck and fingers, worth by his estimate 40 million sesterces. To give you some sense of scale, a Roman legionary soldier earned roughly 900 sesterces a year. Lolia Paulina, on one evening at a dinner, was wearing the equivalent of tens of thousands of years of a soldier's wages, distributed across her own body as casual decoration. Pliny even claims she carried receipts with her that evening to prove the jewels were honestly acquired and not stolen, which, if true, might be one of the strangest flexes recorded anywhere in ancient literature. Valeria's own jewellery box holds nothing remotely close to that scale, but the principle is identical, just smaller. A pair of gold and pearl earrings, a ring, possibly more than one, worn on the 3rd finger of the left hand in a tradition the Romans believed traced back to Egyptian medicine, the idea that a particular nerve ran directly from that finger to the heart, a bracelet shaped like a coiled snake, a genuinely common Roman motif that we tend to find a little unsettling today but that carried associations of protection, renewal, even fertility in their world rather than anything sinister. Each piece goes on with the quiet, practiced help of the maid, fastened, checked in a small polished bronze mirror, adjusted, checked again. By the time all of this is finished, The sky outside has gone from black to that soft, undecided grey that comes just before real daylight, and the household has woken fully around her. There is bread on a low table now, sometimes dipped in wine and honey, sometimes eaten plain with a little cheese, and Romans of this period were not generally big breakfast people. The morning meal, the ientaculum, was meant to be quick, light, functional. Save the real eating for later in the day. Valeria eats standing, partly out of habit and partly because sitting down properly in the stola she is now wearing requires a certain care she does not feel like exercising twice in one morning. Before she leaves, she stops briefly at the household shrine. Nearly every Roman home of any size kept one, a small niche in the wall, sometimes elaborate, sometimes nothing more than a painted alcove, housing little bronze or terracotta figures of the Lars, the household guardian spirits, along with whichever personal gods the family favoured. Valeria's shrine holds a small statue of Fortuna, goddess of luck, fate, and the unpredictable turning of circumstance, which feels honestly like an appropriate goddess for anyone about to spend a day watching events whose entire appeal rested on not knowing what would happen next. She murmurs something brief, not a long prayer, more a habit worn smooth by repetition, a request that today go well, that the household stay healthy, that nothing unexpected arrive at the door while she is out. Religion, for most Romans, was rarely the dramatic, thunderous thing we sometimes imagine. It was woven into the texture of an ordinary morning the way checking the weather is woven into ours. Quick, practical, done without much ceremony, and then you move on with your day. Outside, the street has properly woken now. A baker's apprentice is dragging a tray of loaves toward a stall on the corner. Somewhere nearby, a dog is barking at nothing in particular, the way dogs everywhere always have, and threaded through all of it, unmistakable even this early, is a kind of forward momentum in the crowd noise itself. A current of people already moving in roughly the same direction, toward the river, then east, toward the great pale curve of stone rising up out of the low ground between the hills. Games days had their own particular sound in Rome, a kind of layered, building hum that started before dawn and did not really stop until well after dark. You could tell just from the noise outside your window that today was not an ordinary day. The litter is waiting in the small courtyard behind the house, a long curtained box mounted on poles, carried by 4 household slaves who will spend the next hour navigating streets that were, by any modern measure, absurdly narrow and absurdly crowded. Riding in a litter through the streets of Rome was less like the smooth, gliding image you might have in your head and more like being inside a small, swaying room while the men carrying you shout, swear, and occasionally physically shove their way through foot traffic that has no particular interest in moving aside for anyone. Valeria settles onto the cushions, pulls the curtain partly closed, not entirely, because she likes to watch the city pass, and the bearers lift the poles onto their shoulders with the kind of practiced grunt that suggests this is far from the heaviest thing they have carried today. Through the gap in the curtain, Rome does what Rome always does, which is overwhelm you with detail whether you asked for it or not. A fuller's shop releases a smell that is somehow both chemical and faintly of urine, since stale urine was genuinely an important ingredient in the Roman process of cleaning and whitening wool, collected from public latrines specifically for this purpose. I know how that sounds. It sounded perfectly normal to them. A few doors down, a woman leans out of a second-floor window of an insula, one of the tall, cramped apartment blocks that housed most of the city's population, to call something down to a vendor below, her words lost in the general noise before Valeria's litter has even passed beneath her. The streets thicken as they get closer. More litters now, more people on foot, a steady current of colour and movement all flowing the same direction, toward the amphitheatre, and Valeria notices, the way she notices it every single games day, the particular texture of who is walking and who is being carried. The wealthy ride, everyone else walks, sometimes for an hour or more from the far edges of the city, some of them having left home well before dawn to secure a decent spot in the standing crowd outside the gates. There is no shame attached to walking exactly, but there is a clear, unspoken hierarchy laid out in the street itself, visible at a glance, the same hierarchy that is about to follow everyone inside the building and determine with startling precision exactly where each of them will be allowed to sit. A boy darts alongside the litter for a few steps, holding up small clay tokens, hawking what are almost certainly counterfeit prediction tickets. Little tablets claiming to forecast which gladiator will win which match, sold to anyone gullible or hopeful enough to buy one before the day even properly begins. Valeria's bearers wave him off without slowing. She catches a glimpse of his face, disappointed but already turning toward the next litter in line, and feels something close to fondness for the sheer persistence of it. Rome ran, in no small part, on people exactly like him, the small operators working every angle of every public gathering for a few extra coins. The amphitheatre itself announces its presence well before you can see all of it. First the noise, a low continuous roar of thousands of conversations happening at once, punctuated by vendors shouting prices, somewhere a flute player working through the same 6 notes over and over, hoping for coins. Then, rising above the rooftops as the litter turns a final corner, the pale curved wall itself, 4 stories of arches stacked one on top of the other, each level styled in a different order of column, Doric below, then Ionic, then Corinthian, then a flat panelled top tier that Valeria, like most Romans, has never had any particular reason to think about architecturally. It is simply there, enormous, permanent feeling in a way that very few buildings in the ancient world actually were, even though it had stood for barely 3 years. Now we get to the part of this story I promised we would return to, and I want to slow down here, because it is genuinely one of my favourite details in all of Roman social history, in the sense that it is infuriating and fascinating in roughly equal measure. The Colosseum had 76 numbered public entrances on its ground level, each one leading toward a different wedge of seating, and every single person attending knew, with no ambiguity at all, exactly which entrance and which section corresponded to their precise rank in Roman society. There was no general admission in the modern sense, no first-come, first-served scramble for a good view. Your seat was your status, made physical, carved into stone tiers that placed you, quite literally, above or below your neighbours depending on what you were worth in the eyes of the state. This system traces back to a law passed under Augustus, more than a century before Valeria's mourning, called the Lex Julia Theathralis. Augustus, ever the obsessive organizer of Roman public life, decided that the old, looser arrangement of seating, where rich and poor had apparently mixed somewhat more freely at public spectacles, was unacceptable, a blurring of the social order he was trying so hard to project as natural and eternal. So he formalized it. Senators sat closest to the arena floor, in the area called the orchestra, close enough to see the expressions on a gladiator's face, close enough that blood and sand sometimes reached the front rows on a violent enough day. Above them, the equites, the wealthy business and military class just below senatorial rank. Above the equites, ordinary male citizens, organized further still by tribe and by marital status, since married men with children were given somewhat better placement than bachelors, a small but telling piece of state policy nudging Roman men toward family life through something as mundane as seating assignments. And then, above all of that, at the very top of the entire structure, under the colonnade on the 4th level, in the section with the worst sightlines, the most distance from the action, and during a Roman summer, almost unbearable heat trapped beneath that highest roofline, women, all women, every single one of them, regardless of wealth, regardless of husband's rank, regardless of family name, the senator's wife and the freed woman selling bread outside the gate sat, functionally, in the same general zone, separated mostly by how close to the front of that zone they could manage to position themselves. Domitian, the emperor currently on the throne in our story, actually tightened this rule further during his reign, becoming notably stricter about enforcing it after reports, whether true or exaggerated, that wealthy women had been finding ways to sit closer to the action than the law technically allowed. He did not relax the restriction, he reinforced it. I want to sit with that for one more moment before we move on, because I think it is easy to hear a fact like this and let it slide past without really feeling its weight. Valeria this morning spent hours having her hair built into an architectural marvel, was dressed in a stola trimmed with imported purple, wears pearls in her ears that cost more than a soldier earns in years, and travels by litter carried by other human beings, and none of it, not one piece of it, will get her one seat closer to the gladiators than the poorest woman walking in through the public gates on foot. In the one place in Rome built specifically to put hierarchy on physical vertical display, womanhood itself flattened almost every other distinction that normally separated these two women's entire lives. That is the paradox sitting underneath this whole story, and it is the kind of detail that, the longer you turn it over, the stranger and more pointed it becomes. There was notably one exception, and it is worth knowing because it tells you something about what Rome actually valued enough to bend its own rules for. The Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, sworn to 30 years of chastity and ritual purity in service of the state, were granted seating in the orchestra, the same prized front section reserved for senators, directly across the arena from the emperor's own box. No other women in Rome received anything close to this privilege. It was not wealth that earned it, and it was not birth, since Vestals were selected as young girls from a range of families not exclusively the wealthiest. It was sacred function. Rome would bend its entire architecture of gender to honor religious purity in a way it would never bend it for mere money, which tells you, I think, something true about where Roman priorities actually sat when you looked past the marble. Valeria's litter cannot, of course, carry her all the way to her seat. It stops well back from the building itself, in a designated area where dozens of other litters are already gathered, bearers standing in small clusters in whatever shade they can find, settling in for what will be a very long day of simply waiting. She steps down, smooths the stola, and joins the slow-moving current of women heading toward the entrance assigned to their section, leaving her husband somewhere on the far side of the building, walking into an entirely different door, toward an entirely different world inside the same structure. The climb itself deserves a moment of honesty, because it was genuinely punishing. To reach the 4th level, women walked up a long sequence of internal staircases and ramps, vaulted corridors called vomitoria, a name that has nothing to do with vomiting and everything to do with the Latin verb meaning to spew forth, since that is essentially what these passages did with crowds, releasing them rapidly into the seating tiers from a network of internal corridors that still strikes modern engineers as remarkably efficient even now. Remarkably efficient, however, did not mean comfortable, and climbing 3 or 4 full stories of stone steps in a long stola, in sandals never designed for serious walking, in the rising heat of a Roman late morning, was simply part of the cost of attendance if you happened to be a woman, no matter how grand your morning had been before you arrived. Near the top of one staircase, Valeria falls in step, more or less by accident, the way strangers often do when they are climbing the same stairs at the same exhausting pace, with another woman entirely unlike her. Let us call this one Flavia, though she would never have shared a name with the emperor's own family by anything but coincidence, and the coincidence would not have struck either of them as remarkable, since it was an extremely common name. Maybe she is a freed woman now, formerly enslaved, granted her freedom some years back by a household that no longer needed her labor as urgently as it once had. Maybe she spends her days working in a Folanoka, one of the cloth processing workshops scattered through the poorer districts, her hands permanently roughened by lye and stale urine and the constant wringing of wet wool. Maybe she walked here this morning from well outside the city's wealthier quarters, leaving before sunrise to be sure of a decent spot in the standing crowd, since the upper tier, unlike the seats below, was often standing room only, wooden bleachers at best, with no marble, no cushions, nothing but a long day on your feet and whatever spot you managed to claim early enough. Here is the detail I find unexpectedly moving about this particular floor of the building. For one single day climbing these same impossible stairs, sweating through the same impossible heat, a senator's wife and a freed woman from a laundry shop are, in the eyes of the building itself, functionally the same person. Flavia cannot afford the perfume Valeria wears. Valeria has never in her life wrung a wet toga by hand in lye water until her knuckles cracked. And yet here, in this one place, on this one level, neither of those facts matters even slightly. They are women, and the architecture has already decided on their behalf exactly how much that single category is worth. They do not become friends, exactly, not in the deep sense the word implies today, but there is a particular kind of brief, easy camaraderie that happens between strangers forced into the same uncomfortable circumstance. A shared roll of the eyes at the steepness of the last flight of stairs, a passing comment about the heat already building under the colonnade roof even though it is barely mid-morning. Flavia has brought food wrapped in cloth, bread and a little cheese and some olives, since the upper-tier crowd generally could not afford or simply did not bother with. The vendors selling food closer to the better seats below. Valeria, who has never once in her adult life packed her own lunch for anything, finds herself, almost involuntarily, a little curious about what is in the cloth. They settle, eventually, into a section of the wooden bleachers along the topmost ring, and the view from up here is, despite everything, genuinely striking. You can see the whole oval at once, the pale sand of the arena floor far below looking smaller and almost toy-like from this height, and beyond the rim of the building, glimpses of the city itself, rooftops and the green smudge of distant hills, a vantage point that, on a clear day, almost makes the climb feel worth it. Almost. Above them, stretched across enormous wooden masts anchored into stone sockets built directly into the top of the outer wall, hangs the Valerium, a vast system of canvas awnings designed to shade the crowd from the worst of the midday sun. Operating it was a genuinely skilled, physically demanding job, typically handled by sailors brought in specifically from the Imperial fleet stationed at Misenum, since rigging, ropework and managing enormous sheets of canvas under windload was, in essence, exactly the same skill set required to manage sails on a warship. You can hear them sometimes, faintly, shouting instructions to each other along the upper rim of the building, adjusting one section of canvas as the angle of the sun shifts through the day, and there is something quietly remarkable in knowing that watching gladiators fight required, behind the scenes, a small detachment of the Roman navy working ropes high above the crowd like sailors managing rigging in a storm that never quite arrives. The awning does not reach this far up, not fully. The top tier, where Valeria and Flavia now stand pressed in among hundreds of other women, gets shade unevenly at best, depending on the hour and the angle, and there is something almost symbolic in that too, though neither woman would have phrased it that way at the time. Even the relief from the sun was distributed according to the same hierarchy as everything else. The senators below sat in the best shade, the best seats, the best view, while the women above baked slowly under whatever scraps of shadow the canvas happened to throw their way. A horn sounds somewhere below, a long, low note that ripples outward through the crowd and produces an almost instant hush, the kind of collective intake of breath that happens right before something enormous is about to begin. The morning's events are about to start, and the morning in Roman games almost always belonged to the animals. The Venationes, the staged animal hunts, opened nearly every full day of games, and the sheer scale of what Rome was willing to import for a single morning's entertainment is, even now, difficult to fully absorb. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the same general region, brought up through ports along the coast that had, by this point in history, organized entire trade networks specifically around supplying Roman games with exotic, dangerous animals. Elephants occasionally transported by ship at enormous expense and considerable risk, since keeping a large land animal alive across weeks of sea travel was its own significant feat of ancient logistics. Ostriches, brought down from beyond Egypt, valued partly for their strange, almost comic appearance to Roman eyes, and partly because hunting one down in the arena, with a few well-placed arrows, made for a surprisingly popular spectacle. There are even accounts of rhinoceroses appearing in games of this general period, animals so unfamiliar to most Romans that descriptions of them, when they survive at all, read almost like travelers' tall tales rather than zoology. The opening events of the morning were not always violent in the way people assume. There were trained animal performances too, displays of remarkable, almost theatrical skill. Elephants taught to kneel, to write letters in the sand with their trunks according to some ancient accounts, though I will admit that particular claim always strikes me as the kind of thing that grew more impressive with each retelling. There were exotic creatures simply paraded around the arena floor for the crowd to gawk at, since most people in Rome, including most women in this top tier, would otherwise never in their entire lives see a live lion, let alone an elephant, up close. For a great many spectators, this was less about bloodshed and more about witnessing the genuine, almost geographic vastness of the empire made visible, the literal far edges of the known world delivered, alive, to a single building in the middle of the city for an audience to look at, in person, in wonder. And then, often, it turned violent, because staged hunts pitting trained fighters called bestiari against dangerous animals were also a central part of the morning program, along with animals set against each other, a practice that strikes most modern viewers as far more disturbing than human combat. Somehow, even though it occupied roughly equal billing in the Roman mind, Flavia watches with the kind of open, unguarded fascination of someone who has genuinely never seen anything like it before, and likely never will again outside this building. Valeria, who has attended several games over the years, watches with something closer to mild, practiced interest, the difference between someone encountering a marvel for the first time and someone who has, in a sense, already filed marvels of this particular type under things she has seen before. This is worth noticing, actually, because it pushes back gently against the flattened image we sometimes carry of Roman spectators as a single, uniform, bloodthirsty mass. They were not. Some genuinely loved this part of the day above all else. Some found it tedious, a long warm-up act before the events they actually came for. Some, and the sources do mention this, found the animal violence genuinely upsetting, even by Roman standards, and there are surviving accounts of spectators expressing unexpected sympathy for animals being slaughtered in large numbers, a flicker of discomfort even within a culture that had, in most other respects, normalized this kind of public violence almost completely. Cicero himself, writing decades earlier about a particularly large staged hunt involving elephants, describes a wave of what he calls pity moving through part of the crowd, an unexpected emotional response that even he seems slightly surprised to record. It is a small detail, easy to miss, but it matters, because it reminds us that Roman audiences were not a single mind reacting identically to everything placed in front of them. They were thousands of individual people, each one carrying their own private threshold for what felt thrilling and what felt simply too much, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a building that gave no one, regardless of how they actually felt, any real way to leave early without drawing attention to themselves. Around midday, the program shifted again into territory that even Roman sources themselves describe with a certain unease: the public execution of condemned criminals, staged as spectacle, sometimes set against animals, sometimes carried out through other theatrical, deliberately humiliating methods meant to double as moral instruction for the watching crowd. I am not going to walk through the mechanics of this in detail, partly because it serves no real purpose here, and partly because the sheer cruelty of it sits at an uncomfortable distance from everything else we are exploring tonight. What matters for our purposes is the function it served in Roman civic life, however unsettling that function looks to us now. These were not random victims. Roman law treated this kind of execution as a punishment reserved specifically for the most serious crimes, and the spectacle of it was deliberate state messaging, a visible demonstration that the boundaries of Roman law carried real, physical, irreversible consequences, performed in front of as many citizens as the building could hold. For the women in the upper tier, this part of the day was, by most accounts, the quietest stretch, in tone if not in volume. Many simply used the time to eat, to rest legs that had been standing for hours, to talk quietly among themselves while the crowd below reacted in waves to whatever was unfolding on the sand far beneath them. Distance here did its own strange work. From the height of the fourth tier, details blurred. What was vivid and immediate for senators in the front rows became, for women at the top of the building, something closer to a hum of noise and movement far below, observed more than experienced. Flavia eats a little more of her bread. Valeria finds herself looking, instead, out at the city beyond the rim of the building, at the hills going slightly hazy in the building heat of early afternoon. It is worth saying, too, that not every games day even included this segment, and the frequency and brutality of these midday executions varied considerably depending on the emperor, the occasion, and the specific political moment Rome happened to be living through. Some days the program moved straight from animal hunts into an early afternoon break and then directly into gladiatorial combat. Today happens to be one of the heavier days, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over the upper tier by the time the horns finally sound again, signaling that the worst of the midday program has ended and a longer break is beginning before the afternoon's main event. The break stretches into what feels, from this height, like a small festival of its own. Vendors move through the lower aisles, selling honeyed wine, roasted chickpeas, small wrapped parcels of bread and sausage, though getting any of it carried all the way up to the fourth tier required either a particularly determined seller or, more often, simply meant the upper crowd went without and relied on whatever they had carried in themselves, exactly as Flavia did. Occasionally a sparsio took place, a deliberate theatrical sprinkling of scented water or saffron-infused liquid released from devices positioned around the upper rim of the building, meant to cool and perfume the crowd below all at once. A small luxury distributed, briefly, almost democratically, since scent, unlike seating, did not respect tier lines once it drifted on the air. There were also miscellia, gifts thrown out into the crowd by the editor of the games, the wealthy sponsor footing the bill for the entire day, sometimes small wooden balls or tokens that could be exchanged later for prizes, occasionally actual food, fruit, even small coins on a particularly generous occasion. This was real political theatre, a visible, immediate demonstration of generosity meant to bind the crowd's goodwill directly to whichever powerful man had paid for the day's entertainment. The catching of these miscellia, however, happened almost entirely in the lower, better seats, close enough to the action that men down there scrambled, shoved, occasionally fought each other outright over a tossed token. From the top tier, Valeria and Flavia watched this scramble unfold far below them like a strange silent drama performed at a distance, close enough to see the shapes of bodies moving but too far to make out any individual face, and certainly far too high up for anything thrown from below to ever reach them. Something worth noticing sits inside that detail too. Generosity in Rome, like everything else that day, travelled downward through the same fixed channels of status that governed the seating itself. Wealth flowed to the men close enough to grab it. Scent drifted freely to everyone, because scent alone refused to obey the architecture. The horns sound again, longer this time, and the crowd's energy shifts into something noticeably different from the morning. This is what most of the building actually came for. Gladiators emerge from the gates at the base of the arena, and even from 4 stories up, there is a kind of electricity that moves through the upper tier. A leaning forward, a hush followed almost immediately by a rising murmur of names being repeated from mouth to mouth. Because here is the truth that almost never makes it into the popular image of Roman women as passive, sheltered, modestly disinterested in violence happening below them. Many of them were, by every honest measure available to us, enormously, enthusiastically invested in gladiatorial combat, and more specifically in the gladiators themselves as individuals, as personalities, as something startlingly close to what we would now recognize as celebrities. This is where the Roman satirist Juvenal becomes genuinely useful to us, even though we have to read him carefully, since satire by its very nature exaggerates for effect and was never meant to be read as straightforward documentary fact. In his sixth satire, an extended, often savagely unfair rant about the supposed moral failings of Roman women, he tells the story of a senator's wife named Epia who abandoned her husband, her children, her entire comfortable life, to run off with a gladiator named Sergius, a man Juvenal describes in deeply unflattering physical terms: scarred, missing an eye, his face genuinely disfigured by his profession, and yet Juvenal insists, irresistible to Epia precisely because he was a gladiator. The sword, Juvenal writes, with characteristic bitterness is what she loved. Now, I want to be careful here because it would be easy to take a satirist's exaggerated, deeply misogynistic complaint and treat it as solid proof of widespread behavior, and that is not quite fair to the evidence we actually have. Juvenal was writing comedy of outrage, not sociology. But here is what makes this detail genuinely useful rather than simply scandalous. Satire only lands, only makes an audience laugh or nod along, when it exaggerates something the audience already recognizes as at least partly true. Nobody writes an entire extended bit mocking a phenomenon that does not exist in some recognizable form. That Juvenal could build an entire scandalous set piece around a respectable woman's infatuation with a gladiator tells us that this particular fantasy, this particular social anxiety about women and gladiators, was already alive and well in the Roman imagination, regardless of how often it actually happened in literal fact. And there is other, less satirical evidence pointing in the same direction. Graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii, preserved by sheer historical accident under the volcanic ash that buried the city, includes lines praising specific gladiators in language that reads, even across 2,000 years, as unmistakably romantic. One particularly famous piece of surviving graffiti calls a gladiator named Celadus the girl's desire, the one who makes the girls sigh, using language that would not feel remotely out of place scrawled across a modern locker room wall about a popular athlete. These were not anonymous fighters to the women watching them. They had names, they had followings. Some had what we might cautiously call fan bases, women who knew their records, their wins, their particular fighting style, the way someone today might follow a favorite player across an entire season. There is even a persistent ancient claim, recorded by Pliny the Elder among others, that gladiator sweat scraped from their skin after a match and mixed into cosmetic preparations was sold and used by Roman women as a kind of beauty treatment or aphrodisiac, believed to transfer some of the gladiator's vitality, his strength, his raw physical potency, directly onto the skin of whoever applied it. I genuinely do not know how widespread this practice actually was, versus how much it functioned as a piece of cultural gossip Romans told about each other, the ancient equivalent of an urban legend repeated so often it eventually got written down as fact. Either way, true or simply widely believed, it tells you something real about how Roman culture imagined the relationship between gladiators and the women watching them. Not distant admiration, something closer, stranger, more physically charged than that. Valeria, for her part, has a favourite, as most regular attendees did. Aretiarius, one of the lightly armoured fighters who fought with a net and trident rather than the heavier armour and shield of other gladiator types, known for a particular speed and agility that made his matches genuinely unpredictable to watch. She would never, of course, phrase her interest the way Juvenal accuses Epia of feeling hers. That would be scandalous, the sort of thing that ends marriages and reputations in equal measure. But there is a sharpening of attention in her posture as he steps out onto the sand, a brief private flicker of something that does not need a name to be entirely real. Here is a detail that genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it, and it surprised me too when I first came across it. Women themselves, on rare occasions, fought as gladiators, Not commonly, not as any kind of standard fixture of the games, but documented clearly enough in enough separate sources that historians no longer treat it as legend. A marble relief discovered near Halicarnassus in what is now southwestern Turkey, dated to roughly this same general period, depicts two female fighters in full gladiatorial gear, identified by inscription with names that read like stage names rather than birth names. Amazon and Achillea, locked in what appears to be a real, equally matched combat, both shown bare-chested in the manner typical of male gladiator depictions, both clearly fighting with serious weapons rather than anything ornamental or theatrical. The historian Suetonius mentions female fighters appearing in games sponsored by Domitian specifically, sometimes pitted against dwarves in a pairing meant, it seems, primarily for novelty and shock value rather than genuine athletic spectacle, which tells us something slightly uncomfortable about how even genuinely skilled female fighters could be exploited for their novelty, rather than respected for their skill. These women, the gladiatresses, occupied an even stranger social position than male gladiators, which is saying something because male gladiators already lived in one of the odder contradictions Roman society ever produced. A successful gladiator could be wildly famous, genuinely adored, his face and his record known across the entire city, his presence in a match enough to fill seats and drive up the value of the games themselves. And at the exact same time, under Roman law, a gladiator was classified among the infames, the legally and socially disgraced, a category that also included actors, prostitutes, and certain other public performers, stripped of basic civic rights regardless of how loudly the crowd cheered for him on any given afternoon, adored and despised simultaneously by the same culture, often by the very same people. Valeria's affection for her favourite Rhyterius and Juvenal's outrage at Eppia's supposed elopement are, in a strange way, two sides of the exact same coin. Rome wanted its gladiators thrilling enough to fill an amphitheatre, and disgraced enough that no respectable woman should ever actually want one. Female gladiators inherited all of that contradiction and then added another layer on top of it, since a woman stepping into the arena to fight was also, simply by doing so, stepping wildly outside every expectation Roman culture held about femininity itself. This was rare enough, and controversial enough, that the Emperor Septimius Severus, ruling more than a century after our story tonight, eventually banned female gladiatorial combat outright, suggesting it had never settled comfortably into Roman public life even after generations of at least occasional practice. Some things apparently remained too strange for Rome to fully absorb, even a culture as comfortable with public violence as this one. The match itself, when it finally begins, unfolds with a rhythm that takes newcomers like Flavia a little while to read, and that regular attendees like Valeria have long since learnt to anticipate. There is an opening phase of circling, testing, each fighter reading the other's stance, the crowd's noise rising and falling with every feint and near miss. There is often a longer middle stretch that can feel almost meditative in its patience, two skilled fighters refusing to overextend, conserving energy, the crowd's attention narrowing to something closer to held breath. And then, eventually, a shift, sudden and decisive, the kind of moment that explains more than anything else why 50,000 people would climb stone stairs and sit for hours in brutal heat just for the chance to witness it live, unscripted, with a real and unpredictable outcome. From the top tier, the details blur slightly with distance, the same way the midday executions had, but the noise compensates for whatever the eye cannot quite resolve. A particularly skilled exchange sends a wave of sound rolling upward through the entire building, tier by tier, until it reaches the women at the very top a half-second after it started below, a kind of delayed echo of the crowd's reaction rippling up through 40 feet of stone and humanity. Valeria finds herself standing, without quite deciding to, leaning forward against the low barrier in front of her bleacher row, her earlier mild interest sharpened now into something genuinely urgent. Flavia is gripping the same barrier a few feet away, her packed lunch forgotten entirely. Somewhere far below, in a box positioned at the midpoint of one long side of the arena, elevated and shaded and entirely separate from every other seat in the building, sits the one woman in all of Rome whose seating was never subject to any of this. The pulvinar, the imperial box, held the emperor and his immediate family, and on a day like this that almost certainly includes Domitia, Domitian's wife, watching from a vantage point closer to the action than any senator, closer even than most senators' own wives could ever hope to sit, by virtue of one single fact that overrode every rule the Lex Julia Theatralis had ever established. She was married to the one man in the empire whose preferences the seating chart itself was built to serve. It is worth remembering here that imperial women lived in a category entirely their own, suspended somewhere above the normal rules that governed everyone else, including the rules that governed every other woman in the building. Earlier empresses had set standards of luxury that still echo through the historical record with a kind of dazed disbelief even now. Pearls again mattered enormously here too, since pearls remained, across generations of Roman elite women, the single most coveted form of personal wealth a woman could wear on her own body, valued even above gold in certain circles, precisely because their rarity and their delicate, almost impossible beauty made them feel less like currency and more like a small private miracle each time one was found inside an oyster pulled from some distant sea. Whatever Domitia happens to be wearing today, and we genuinely have no specific record of it, the broader pattern holds. Imperial women operated on a scale of luxury that made even Valeria's careful, expensive mourning look almost restrained by comparison. And yet, strangely, this same imperial woman, married to the man who controlled every law governing every seat in this entire building, would have understood Valeria's earlier walk through the streets, her hours of preparation, her quiet attention toward a favorite gladiator, far better than either of them probably realized. Status in Rome was a ladder with an enormous number of rungs, and almost every woman standing or sitting in this building today, all the way from the imperial box down to the freed woman beside Valeria in the cheapest standing section, understood instinctively that she occupied some specific fixed position on it, whether she had chosen that position or not. Valeria's Retiarius wins in the end through a final sudden burst of speed that brings the crowd to its feet across nearly every tier of the building at once, even the distant fourth level where she stands now with her hands pressed flat against the warm stone barrier in front of her. There is a particular kind of relief in a moment like this that has nothing to do with the outcome itself and everything to do with the release of accumulated tension, the sound of an entire building exhaling at once. Not every match ended this cleanly, of course. Some fighters died on the sand, and Roman audiences, whatever else we might say about them, generally understood and accepted this as the basic unavoidable cost of the spectacle they had come to witness. Mercy was sometimes granted missio, the gesture of an editor sparing a defeated but skilled fighter who had fought honorably, the crowd's own shouted opinion often weighing heavily on that decision in ways that gave even the upper tier, distant and removed as it was, a real if small voice in the outcome below. I think it is worth pausing here briefly on something that often gets flattened in modern retellings of Roman spectacle, which is the assumption that everyone watching felt nothing but simple, uncomplicated bloodlust. The actual emotional experience of attending the games for most Romans, women very much included, was almost certainly far more layered than that. There was genuine athletic appreciation, the kind of respect you might have for any skilled, trained performer risking real injury in front of you. There was the social experience of simply being present, seen, part of a massive shared civic event that connected you, for one day, to the entire city around you. There was anxiety sometimes for a favorite fighter, real and personal in exactly the way Valeria felt it just now. And there was, underneath all of it, a kind of cultural framework around death itself that simply does not map cleanly onto how most of us think about mortality today. a worldview shaped by a religion with no promised afterlife of comfort, by a society that had buried staggering numbers of infants and mothers and young soldiers across every single generation, and that had, as a result, developed a relationship with sudden public death that was neither casual nor quite as horrified as our own. None of that makes the violence itself any less real, and I do not want to suggest otherwise. But it does mean that the women sitting in that top tier were not simply passive witnesses to cruelty, blank-faced and indifferent. They were complicated people, carrying complicated, sometimes contradictory feelings, exactly the way we carry complicated feelings now about things we watch, cheer for, and sometimes later feel strange about once the noise of the moment has faded. The afternoon wears on, match following match, the angle of light sliding slowly across the arena floor as the sun continues its long arc westward. The heat under the colonnade has settled into something heavier now, less the sharp morning warmth and more a thick, accumulated weight that presses down on the whole upper tier, and Valeria notices, almost without meaning to, the particular quality of light filtering down through the gaps where the Valerium does not quite reach this high, gold and slightly dusty, catching the haze of sand kicked up from the arena floor below, until it almost looks, from this distance, like the entire building is breathing out a fine, pale mist. The marble of the lower tiers, when she can glimpse it between the heads of the crowd in front of her, has gone warm enough now that you could probably feel the heat of it through a sandal, if anyone up here were close enough to marble to test the theory. Between matches, while attendants rake fresh sand across the arena floor and stagehands clear away whatever needs clearing, the upper tier settles into its own quieter rhythm of conversation. And this, honestly, might be my favourite part of imagining this whole day, because it is the part that survives least in any official record, and yet feels, somehow, the most real. Women talk about the match just finished, about the one coming next, but also about everything else that fills an ordinary life. In the particular unguarded way people talk when they are killing time among strangers they will likely never see again after today. Flavia mentions somewhere in this stretch that her sister is being matched with a man from a neighbouring district, a wool merchant of modest but respectable means, and Valeria, despite the gulf in their circumstances, finds herself offering opinions on the matter with exactly the same energy she might apply to a marriage being arranged within her own social circle. Marriage in Rome, across every level of society, was rarely the private, romantic decision we tend to imagine today. It was a negotiation, often heavily managed by parents, sometimes by professional matchmakers, weighing dowries, family connections, reputation, and practical compatibility in ways that could feel, to modern ears, almost transactional, even though real affection certainly grew, plenty of times, in side arrangements that began this way. A respectable Roman wedding involved a formal betrothal, witnesses, a dowry transferred from the bride's family, a ceremony that varied in elaborateness depending on means but almost always included a procession through the streets to the husband's home. The bride carried partly over the threshold in a gesture meant to avoid the bad luck of stumbling on her very first step into married life. Valeria offers a small practical piece of advice about negotiating dowry terms, the kind of thing she picked up second-hand from her own mother years earlier, and Flavia listens with the genuine attention of someone collecting useful information regardless of where it happens to come from. There is something quietly democratic about this exchange that the building's architecture would never have allowed in any other context. Knowledge, unlike seating, unlike jewellery, unlike the quality of one's perfume, moved freely between these two women, untouched by any law Augustus or Domitian had ever passed. A vendor finally does manage to work his way up the final stretch of stairs, balancing a tray of honeyed nuts and small clay cups of watered wine, and the upper tier erupts into a brief flurry of haggling and small exchanged coins, everyone suddenly remembering how hungry hours of standing in the heat will make a person. Flavia buys a single cup of wine and insists, despite Valeria's polite protest on sharing it, passing it back and forth between them with the easy, unbothered intimacy of people who have spent an entire long day standing shoulder to shoulder and have, somewhere in the process, stopped being strangers in any meaningful sense, even if they will likely never speak again after today. It is worth mentioning, while we are here among the things women actually owned and kept and treasured, that the archaeological record backs up this picture of genuine gladiator enthusiasm far more thoroughly than written satire alone ever could. Small clay oil lamps decorated with images of gladiators in combat have been found in significant numbers across domestic contexts throughout the Roman world. Not temples, not public buildings, but ordinary homes, suggesting these objects sat on shelves and tables in private houses simply because someone living there wanted to look at them. Hairpins and small decorative items shaped vaguely like the distinctive crossed weapons of particular gladiator types occasionally turn up in excavated households as well, the kind of object that functioned somewhere between practical tool and small personal fandom, not unlike owning a mug shaped like a favorite team's logo, if you will allow me one slightly anachronistic comparison before we move on. None of this proves that every Roman woman shared Epia's supposed scandal, obviously, and most women, including Valeria, lived their entire lives without ever doing anything more dramatic than quietly favouring a particular fighter from a safe, respectable distance. But it does suggest that the fascination itself, the genuine emotional investment in these men as individuals rather than interchangeable performers, was widespread, ordinary, and largely unremarkable, right up until a satirist decided to turn the most extreme imaginable version of it into a punchline aimed at undermining women's reputations more broadly. That too is a very old pattern, dressing up anxiety about women's desire as moral commentary about women's character, and I suspect it will sound at least a little familiar to anyone listening tonight, regardless of which century they happen to be falling asleep in. The final match of the day, when it eventually arrives, carries a different weight than the ones before it. The particular charge anticipation of knowing the program is nearly finished, that whatever happens on the sand in the next several minutes will be the image everyone carries home with them tonight. The editor of the games, the wealthy sponsor whose name will be remembered, at least locally, for having paid for this entire day, makes a final, formal appearance near the imperial box, a gesture of closing generosity, sometimes another small scattering of Massilia, sometimes simply a formal announcement thanking the crowd for their attendance. The kind of civic theatre that reminded everyone present exactly whose money and whose political ambition had made the day possible in the first place. The crowd begins to thin almost the moment the final horn sounds, a slow, reluctant unravelling of 50,000 people back out through those same 76 numbered gates, the same careful sorting by status that had organised everyone's arrival now working, somewhat more loosely, in reverse. Senators and their households tend to wait a little, in no particular hurry, since their litters and their slaves are close at hand and the worst of the crowd will have cleared by the time they actually need to move. The upper tier, by contrast, faces exactly the opposite incentive, every reason in the world to start moving immediately, since the climb down those same long staircases, now crowded with thousands of other descending bodies, is its own slow, shuffling ordeal that nobody wants to face any later than necessary. Valeria and Flavia descend together for a while, simply because the staircase only allows movement in one general direction, and they happen to be standing close to each other when the crowd starts to flow. Somewhere near the bottom, the staircase widens, the crowd fans out toward different exits, and the two women find themselves, without any real ceremony, simply drifting apart, the way the day itself is about to pull them back into two entirely separate versions of Rome. Flavia offers a quick, warm goodbye, something practical about hoping the walk home is not too long in this heat, and disappears into the crowd heading toward the poorer districts on foot. Valeria threads her way back toward the area where the litters wait, scanning the rows of canopied boxes until she spots her own bearers, who have spent the entire day sitting in whatever shade they could find, waiting for exactly this moment. I find myself, every time I imagine this particular instant, genuinely curious about whether either woman ever thought about the other again, probably not in any specific lasting way. The kind of connection that forms between strangers sharing a long, uncomfortable, exciting day rarely survives much past the day itself, not out of coldness, just out of the simple mechanics of two lives that were never built to intersect again. And yet, for several hours on the same hard wooden bench, under the same merciless heat, watching the same fighters and the same animals and the same distant flicker of imperial luxury far below, their experience of being a woman in Rome that day was, in its broad outline, genuinely identical. That feels worth remembering, even if neither of them ever did. The ride home moves through a Rome that has shifted character entirely since the morning. The light has gone long and amber, stretching shadows across streets that felt sharp and bright hours earlier. And the particular smell of the city has changed too. Less bread and more wood smoke now, as households across every district begin preparing the evening meal. Lamps are being lit in shop windows along the route, small flickers of warm light appearing one by one as the litter passes. And there is a softness to the noise of the street now that feels almost deliberate, the whole city easing down from the charged, crowded energy of a games day into something closer to its ordinary evening rhythm. Valeria, alone now behind the curtain of her litter, feels the particular exhaustion that comes less from any single difficult thing, and more from an entire day spent performing, watching, reacting, sitting upright, holding a composed expression across hours of heat and noise and crowd. Her feet ache inside sandals that were never designed for the climb she made twice today, once up and once down. The careful curls built into her hair this morning have softened considerably, no longer the crisp architectural tower they were at dawn, now something looser, slightly collapsed, the visible evidence of an entire day's wear. She does not mind particularly. There is nobody left to perform for on this ride home except herself, and herself at this exact hour mostly just wants to be home. The house when she arrives is warm with lamplight and the smell of something already cooking, and her husband, who arrived back from his own day at the games sometime earlier, greets her with the kind of casual, slightly distracted affection of a man who spent his afternoon several stories below her, watching an entirely different version of the same building she just left. They will compare notes over dinner, in the way couples do after attending the same event from wildly different vantage points, each one slightly amused by what the other did or did not get to see clearly. He will describe details from the orchestra seats that she could only guess at from 4 stories up. She will describe perhaps the particular view of the city itself visible from that high vantage point, a perspective he never had any reason to experience, since men of his rank never sat anywhere near it. Dinner itself, the cena, the main meal of the Roman day, unfolds at a reasonably modest scale tonight. Nothing like the elaborate many-course banquets that wealthier households sometimes staged for guests, since tonight it is simply the two of them and whichever household members happen to share the table. Eggs, a little fish, bread, olives, wine mixed generously with water in the Roman fashion, since drinking wine completely unmixed was considered, depending on the period and the company, either uncouth or specifically associated with excess that respectable households tried to avoid. The conversation drifts easily between the day's events and smaller domestic matters, a leaking roof tile someone needs to deal with, a letter that arrived from a cousin in Campania, the ordinary low hum of 2 people who share a life talking through the accumulated small business of running one. Later, much later, after the lamps in the main rooms have been allowed to burn low and the household has settled into the particular hush that comes once everyone except the mistress of the house has finally gone to sleep, Valeria sits at a small table in her own room and begins, slowly, the long process of undoing everything the morning put together. The earrings come off first, set carefully into their small box, then the ring, then the bracelet, each piece returned to its place with the same quiet, practiced care that brought it out 12 hours earlier. There is a particular kind of relief in this, the same relief in its way that the model example of any era's woman feels when the performance of the day finally gets to end, even though Rome would never have used that exact language to describe it. The hair takes longer, and there is no slave awake at this hour to help with it, so Valeria works through the pins herself, one by one, feeling the careful architecture of the morning slowly collapse under her own fingers until what remains is simply her hair, loose, slightly damp at the roots from the day's heat, falling around her shoulders the way it looked before any of this started. The cosmetics come off next with a cloth and a little oil, the white paleness of the Sarusa wiping away to reveal the actual colour of her skin underneath, slightly flushed still from the sun, faintly lined at the eyes in the particular way a face gets lined after enough years of laughing and squinting and simply being alive. This is the face nobody outside her own household ever sees, tired, real, entirely her own. She thinks briefly before sleep finally takes her, about Flavia somewhere across the city in a much smaller room, presumably going through some version of this same unwinding, though without quite as much to unwind. She thinks about the Retiarius, whose name she does not actually know, only his fighting style and the particular way he moves, and wonders idly whether he is already healing from whatever bruises the match left on him, or already preparing for whichever match comes next. She thinks for just a moment about the climb, the heat, the view from the top of the building looking out over a city she has lived in her entire life, and somehow still does not fully understand the size of until she sees it from that particular height. And then, the way these thoughts tend to go right before sleep, the threads simply loosen and drift apart, and she does not finish any of them. While Valeria sleeps and the lamps in her house burn down to nothing, and the city outside settles into whatever quieter place the size of Rome was ever truly capable of, it is worth pulling back from her single day for a moment and sitting with the larger world that produced it, because the building at the center of this entire story carries its own strange layered history that rarely gets told alongside the human one. The Flavian amphitheater was never actually called the Colosseum during Valeria's lifetime, or for centuries afterward. That name came later, almost certainly derived from a colossal bronze statue that once stood nearby, a statue originally commissioned by the Emperor Nero, depicting himself in the guise of a sun god, towering well over 100 feet tall, positioned at the entrance to his own sprawling private palace complex, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an estate so extravagant that it reportedly included an artificial lake right where the amphitheater itself now stands. When Nero died and his memory became something the Roman state actively wanted to distance itself from, Vespasian, the general who eventually seized power after a brutal year of civil war, made a deliberate, calculated political choice. He drained Nero's private lake and built, on that exact spot, a public amphitheater, open to every citizen of Rome regardless of rank, a literal physical statement that the wasteful private luxury of one disgraced emperor was being returned, transformed into something the entire city could share. The land itself carried that message before a single gladiator ever set foot on its sand. Much of the funding for this enormous project came from the spoils of the Jewish War, the brutal Roman campaign that crushed a major revolt in Judea and ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. An inscription discovered centuries later, reconstructed from the pattern of small holes left by long-vanished bronze letters, appears to confirm that Titus ordered the building constructed using proceeds from that conquest. It is a detail that tends to sit uncomfortably once you actually know it. The wealth and suffering of one conquered people converted directly into stone and spectacle for the entertainment of the conquering one. A connection that the marble itself, gleaming and impressive as it was, never advertised to the crowds filing in through those 76 gates. When the building finally opened under Titus, a handful of years before our story tonight, the celebration lasted, according to the surviving accounts, somewhere in the range of 100 days, an almost unimaginable stretch of continuous games, animal hunts, and staged combat that reportedly included thousands of animals and thousands of fighters across its full run. Titus himself, according to one ancient historian, wept on the final day, whether from genuine emotion at the scale of what had been accomplished, or from sheer physical and political exhaustion after 3 months of presiding over it. We honestly cannot say with any certainty. He died of illness not long afterward, leaving the building and the throne to his younger brother Domitian, the emperor under whose rule Valeria's far more ordinary, single-day version of this experience now takes place. Beneath the arena floor itself, hidden entirely from everyone seated above, ran a complex underground network called the Hypogeum, a maze of tunnels, animal cages, storage rooms, and mechanical lift systems that allowed animals and scenery and even fighters to appear, seemingly by magic, directly onto the sand through trapdoors the audience could not see coming. None of the women in that top tier, nor any of the senators below them, ever glimpsed this hidden machinery directly, and yet every single spectacle they watched depended entirely on its smooth, mostly invisible operation. Dozens of laborers and animal handlers working in cramped, dark conditions far beneath everyone's feet, their labor as essential to the day as anything happening on the sand and almost entirely unremembered by anyone who simply came to watch. That invisible labor brings us back in a way to the women who made Valeria's own mourning possible, the ones whose names rarely survive in any source beyond an occasional mention in a will or a tombstone inscription, if they survive at all. The young ornatrix who pinned her hair before dawn, the 4 men who carried her litter across the city and then sat for hours in the heat outside the amphitheater simply waiting. These were lives almost entirely unrecorded by the kind of history that gets written down in scrolls and speeches and the surviving letters of senators. We know they existed in enormous numbers, since Roman households of any real wealth depended on enslaved labor for nearly every task that kept daily life running, but we know astonishingly little about most of them as individuals, which is its own kind of historical injustice, a silence layered on top of everything else they endured. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the path out of slavery manumission was genuinely possible in Roman society in a way that distinguished it from some other ancient slaveholding cultures, even though possible never meant easy, common, or guaranteed. A slave could be freed by a grateful or aging owner, sometimes as a reward written into a will, sometimes purchased through savings the slave had managed to accumulate over years through small permitted earnings, a practice called the peculium. A freed slave, a libatus or libiter, gained Roman citizenship in many cases, though with certain lasting restrictions, and their own children born after manumission could inherit full and unrestricted citizenship, a generational climb upward that, while far from common, was documented often enough to suggest it represented a real, lived possibility rather than a purely theoretical one. Flavia, the freedwoman who shared Valeria's stares and her wine that day, represents exactly this kind of life, a woman who had crossed that particular threshold and built whatever modest, difficult, genuinely free existence she now had on the other side of it. For the young ornatrix still working in Valeria's household, that future remained, on this particular morning, still entirely unwritten. Maybe she would be freed eventually, rewarded for years of careful, skilled service. Maybe she would not. Roman sources, frustratingly, rarely tell us how these specific, individual stories actually concluded, and that absence itself is worth noticing, rather than smoothing over with comfortable assumption. History remembers Lollia Paulina's 40 million sesterces of jewelry in vivid, specific detail because Pliny found it worth writing down. It does not remember the name of a single hairdresser who built the towering Flavian curls fashionable that exact same decade, even though her skilled hands were every bit as essential to the picture we now associate with Roman feminine beauty as the pearls and the purple dye ever were. It is worth, too, stepping back even further from this single day and asking a broader question, the kind of question that tends to surface naturally once you have spent enough time imagining the texture of one woman's ordinary morning. What was the actual legal and social position of a woman like Valeria within Roman society more generally, beyond the specific vivid injustice of where the architecture forced her to sit? The honest answer is more complicated, and in some ways more interesting, than either extreme version people sometimes assume. Roman women were not, on the whole, kept in the kind of strict domestic seclusion that characterized elite women's lives in classical Athens, where a respectable wife of the citizen class was largely expected to remain within the women's quarters of the home, the gyneceum, rarely appearing in public spaces at all, and certainly never expected to attend something like a public athletic festival as a spectator in her own right. Roman women, by striking contrast, moved through public life with considerably more visible freedom. They attended the theatre, the games, religious festivals, public baths during designated hours, and could be seen on the streets running errands, visiting friends, managing household business, without the same blanket assumption of impropriety that shadowed an Athenian woman simply stepping outside her own front door. Visiting Greek writers occasionally commented, with something between admiration and faint disapproval, on just how publicly visible Roman wives seemed compared to what they considered proper feminine modesty back home. And yet this greater visibility coexisted, often uncomfortably, with real and lasting legal restrictions that shaped a Roman woman's life in ways no amount of public freedom could fully offset. For most of Roman history, a woman remained legally under the authority of a male guardian for her entire life, first her father, then her husband, or, if she became widowed or her father died, some other appointed male relative, a system called tutela mulierum, the guardianship of women. This guardian's formal consent was required for major legal transactions, certain types of property management, and various contracts, even for a wealthy, capable, intelligent woman fully able to handle her own affairs without any practical assistance whatsoever. The law, in other words, did not assume incompetence so much as it assumed permanence, the idea that a woman's legal personhood was simply never meant to stand entirely on its own, regardless of her actual ability. There is some genuinely interesting nuance worth adding here, though, because Roman law was not static across the centuries, and by the period of our story tonight, several legal mechanisms had emerged that gave women, particularly women of means, considerably more practical independence than the bare letter of the old guardianship laws might suggest. A legal status called the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children, granted freeborn women who had given birth to 3 or more children exemption from the requirement of a male guardian altogether, a policy introduced under Augustus specifically to encourage childbearing among the Roman elite, whose birth rates the emperor found alarmingly low. Freed women needed 4 children rather than 3 to gain the same exemption, one more small, telling distinction layered onto an already tiered system of who got to count as fully independent, and under exactly what circumstances. Beyond this, Roman women, unlike their Athenian counterparts, could and did own substantial property in their own names, could inherit directly from fathers and other relatives, and could, with the right legal arrangements, run businesses, manage estates, and in some documented cases, operate as wealthy, independent commercial figures in their own right. We have inscriptions and legal documents preserved from across the empire describing women who owned and operated brickyards, shipping interests, and various trade businesses, sometimes inherited from a deceased husband, sometimes built more directly through their own initiative within whatever legal room the system allowed them. Divorce, too, was considerably more accessible to Roman women than it would be in many later European societies for well over 1,000 years afterward, requiring no elaborate justification or scandal, simply a clear statement of intent communicated to the spouse, with property and dowry arrangements typically settled according to established custom and law, rather than dragged through years of contested proceedings. None of this should be mistaken for anything resembling modern equality, and it would be a genuine distortion of the historical record to suggest otherwise. But it does mean that the women filling the upper tier of that amphitheatre on Valeria's particular afternoon were not, on the whole, uniformly powerless figures confined entirely to silent domestic invisibility. They were running households, negotiating marriages for their daughters, sometimes managing significant property and business interests, attending public festivals and forming, as we saw on those stairs, real if temporary social bonds across lines of wealth and status that the architecture of the building itself was specifically designed to keep separate. The contradiction sits right at the center of the whole picture, visible, capable, and economically present in Roman public life in ways that would have scandalized an Athenian household, and still in that one specific building, on that one specific architectural plan, relegated without exception to the very highest, hottest, furthest tier the entire structure had to offer, regardless of everything else they had ever accomplished or owned or managed in their own right. It is worth, while we are dwelling in this wider frame, thinking for a moment about the handful of Roman women whose names did survive prominently, because the contrast with someone like Valeria tells its own story about how thoroughly power, when a woman managed to reach it, could rewrite even the rules we have spent this whole night describing as fixed and immovable. Livia, wife of Augustus himself, the emperor who had formalized the entire seating hierarchy we have spent so long discussing tonight, occupied a position of influence that stretched across decades and multiple reigns, advising her husband on matters of state with an intimacy and a visibility that scandalized some of the more traditionally minded senators of her era, and that later Roman writers, working under emperors who had their own complicated relationships with powerful mothers and wives, sometimes painted in deliberately sinister terms, suggesting poisoned plots and behind-the-scenes manipulation that we genuinely cannot verify and that may say more about Roman anxiety toward female power than about anything Livia actually did. She was, regardless of the more lurid rumors, formally granted significant honors during her lifetime and was eventually deified after her death, an honor reserved for figures Rome considered to have shaped the state itself in some lasting foundational way. Agrippina the Younger, mother of the Emperor Nero, pushed this even further, appearing on imperial coinage alongside her son in a way that broke sharply with earlier convention, and reportedly attending Senate meetings from behind a curtain, listening to deliberations no woman was technically permitted to witness directly, a workaround that tells you everything about both the strength of the formal restriction and the determination of one specific woman who simply refused to let it fully apply to her. She did not survive her son's growing paranoia about her influence, in the end murdered on his orders after at least one earlier failed attempt, a brutal reminder that proximity to imperial power in Rome carried genuine mortal risk alongside whatever genuine influence it granted, regardless of gender. Even Domitia, the wife sitting in the pulvinar on Valeria's particular afternoon, inhabited a position considerably more complicated than her elevated seat might suggest. Ancient sources, admittedly not always reliable on matters of imperial scandal, describe a marriage strained by Domitian's own jealous, controlling temperament, including a period of exile he reportedly imposed on her after suspecting an affair, followed by a reconciliation that historians still debate the sincerity of. Whatever the truth buried beneath centuries of gossip and politically motivated rumor, it is worth remembering that even the single woman in this entire story, permitted to sit beside the emperor himself, lived a life shaped, constrained, and occasionally endangered by the preferences and suspicions of one powerful man, in ways that rhyme, however imperfectly, with the much smaller, quieter constraints shaping Valeria's own far more ordinary existence 4 stories above her. I think this matters actually more than it might first appear to. We tend, when we tell history, to reach instinctively for the women whose names survived: Livia, Agrippina, the handful of empresses and queens who broke through the silence that swallowed almost everyone else. And there is real value in knowing their stories, but there is something equally valuable, maybe even more valuable for an evening like this one, in spending real time with someone like Valeria instead. A woman invented for tonight's purposes but built entirely out of genuine documented patterns because she represents the actual texture of millions of lives that history simply never bothered to record by name. The empresses tell us what power looked like when a woman managed to seize a sliver of it. Valeria tells us what an ordinary Tuesday looked like for everyone else, which is, in its own quiet way, the far rarer kind of history to actually recover. Games days, of course, were only one thread in a much larger calendar that structured a Roman woman's year, and it feels worth lingering on a few of those other threads before we let Valeria sleep undisturbed for the rest of this story. Because the Colosseum, however dramatic, was genuinely just one stop among many in a yearly rhythm built almost entirely around religious observance, civic festival, and the kind of small domestic ritual that rarely gets remembered as history at all, even though it filled the overwhelming majority of any Roman woman's actual lived time. The Matronalia, celebrated each year in early spring, honored Juno specifically in her role as protector of married women, and on this particular day, custom required husbands to give gifts to their wives, a kind of ancient counterpart to occasions in our own calendar that celebrate romantic partnership. Though the Roman version carried its own specific religious weight tied directly to fertility and the protection of marriage itself, married women would visit the temple of Juno Lucina, offer flowers, and receive in many households small presents from husbands grateful, at least on this one designated day, to acknowledge a debt that custom otherwise rarely required them to articulate quite so directly. June brought Vestalia, centered on the goddess Vesta and her sacred hearth fire, tended continuously by the Vestal virgins we mentioned earlier, the same priestesses who held those prized front row seats at the games. During this festival, ordinary Roman matrons were permitted, for a brief window, into parts of the temple normally closed to anyone outside the priesthood, walking barefoot, bringing offerings of food, honoring the fire that Romans believed, with real and serious civic anxiety, must never under any circumstances be allowed to go out, since its extinction was considered a catastrophic omen for the entire state, not merely a religious inconvenience. And then there was the Bona Dea, the rites of the good goddess, perhaps the single most genuinely mysterious thread in this entire calendar, precisely because it excluded men so completely that we, the historians and writers looking back across 2,000 years, simply do not know with any real confidence what actually happened inside. Held annually in a private home, with the resident matron serving as host and the Vestal virgins again playing a central ceremonial role, this was one of the only spaces in all of Roman religious life that operated under an absolute, rigorously enforced exclusion of men. No exceptions, no male slaves, no male animals even permitted on the premises. With myrtle, the plant sacred to Venus, specifically banned from the proceedings for reasons no surviving source explains clearly. We know the rites existed, we know they mattered enormously to the women who participated, and we know almost nothing else, because the one set of eyes that might have written it all down in exhaustive detail, male eyes, were never allowed anywhere near the room. I find that particular silence almost more eloquent than anything we could ever recover about what happened inside. In a culture that otherwise documented an almost exhausting amount of detail about female behavior, mostly filtered through male anxiety, male satire, male moral judgment, here was one space women carved out and defended successfully enough that it survived as a genuine unbreached mystery for the entire span of Roman history. There is a famous and genuinely scandalous incident recorded by multiple ancient writers in which the politician Publius Clodius Pulcher reportedly disguised himself as a woman specifically to sneak into the rites, was discovered, and triggered a political and religious scandal serious enough to ripple through Roman public life for years afterward. That breaking into this particular room required disguise, deception, and produced a genuine lasting public uproar when it was caught tells you, I think, everything you need to know about how seriously that boundary was actually enforced. Beyond the great public festivals, an ordinary Roman woman's calendar filled in with smaller, quieter observances scattered through nearly every month, household rites tied to the lares and penates, the protective spirits of home and pantry, offerings made at births, at the first cutting of a child's hair, at comings of age, at weddings, at funerals, the entire arc of a human life marked, again and again, by small ritual gestures that almost never made it into any history book, precisely because they were too ordinary, too constant, too woven into the basic texture of simply being alive in that particular century, in that particular city, to strike anyone at the time as worth writing down. There is another thread worth following here too, since we have spent so much of tonight inside one specific building, and that is the rhythm of Roman bathing culture, which occupied a genuinely enormous place in daily life and which women experienced in its own distinctly separate way from men, at least for much of Roman history. The great public bath complexes, the thermae, were not simply places to get clean in any narrow modern sense. They functioned as something closer to a full social institution, combining hot and cold pools, exercise spaces, libraries in some of the grander examples, gardens, areas for massage and grooming, and an enormous amount of simple, unhurried socializing that filled hours of an ordinary afternoon for anyone with the leisure to spend there. For much of the early and middle Republic, bathing customs kept men and women largely separate, either through designated hours, mornings reserved for women, later afternoons for men, or through entirely separate facilities within the same complex. By the period of our story, customs had loosened considerably in many places, and mixed bathing, men and women sharing the same pools at the same hours, had become common enough in parts of the empire to draw genuine moral commentary from writers who considered it a sign of declining standards. Though, predictably enough, this commentary rarely stopped anyone from actually doing it. Some emperors attempted to formally restrict mixed bathing through edict, with Hadrian ruling a few decades after our story tonight, issuing rules requiring separate hours once again, a regulation that tells you mostly that the practice he was banning had clearly become widespread enough to bother regulating in the first place. Valeria, like most women of her standing, visited a smaller, private bath within a women's hours window at a respectable local establishment, rather than navigating whatever arrangement the largest, most crowded public complexes happened to be using that particular season. And the visit itself, on an ordinary day, unfolded as one of the genuine pleasures available to her, a slow progression through rooms of varying temperature, the tepidarium offering a gentle warm transition, the caldarium delivering real enveloping heat meant to open the pores and work the day's grime loose, finished with a bracing plunge into the frigidarium that left the skin tight and alert in a way that, by every account we have, Romans of every class genuinely seemed to love. An attendant, often enslaved, would work scented oil into the skin and then scrape it away with a curved bronze instrument called a strigil, removing oil, sweat and dirt together in long, careful strokes, a practice that functioned as the primary Roman method of actually cleaning the body, since soap as we understand it today played a far smaller role in Roman hygiene than the oil and strigil combination did. This particular ritual, oiling and scraping, connects in an unexpected, almost poetic way back to something we touched on earlier tonight, the rumoured use of gladiator sweat scraped from fighters after a match and folded into cosmetic preparations. The exact same physical gesture, the strigil moving across skin to gather up whatever the body had produced, whether ordinary sweat in an ordinary bath, or the celebrated sweat of a favourite fighter just off the sand, carried, in the Roman imagination, a kind of transferable potency that modern hygiene has mostly stripped of any meaning beyond simple cleanliness. To them, what came off the skin was never quite neutral. It carried something of the person it came from, for better reasons in a beauty preparation, and for more practical reasons in an ordinary afternoon at the baths. And either way, the gesture itself, oil and scrape, repeated across an entire empire's worth of bathhouses every single day, was as constant and unremarkable a part of Roman life as brushing your teeth is to ours. Education followed a similarly uneven pattern, generous in some respects and tightly limited in others, depending heavily on a girl's family wealth and the particular inclinations of her father, since formal schooling for girls existed nowhere near as a guaranteed or expected part of growing up the way it did, at least in basic form, for boys of citizen families. Wealthier households frequently arranged private tutors for daughters as well as sons, at least through the early years, teaching reading, writing, and basic arithmetic alongside skills considered specifically feminine, weaving, household management, music, sometimes dance. Beyond that early stage, most girls' formal education simply stopped, redirected entirely toward the practical training that would prepare them for marriage and household management, while boys of the same families often continued on toward rhetoric, law, and the kind of advanced study that led eventually toward public life. And yet, scattered throughout the historical record, we find genuine exceptions striking enough that they were specifically remarked upon by contemporaries, which tells you both that they were real and that they were rare enough to merit comment. Cornelia, mother of the famous reformist brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, was celebrated for generations afterward as a model of erudite, deeply literate Roman motherhood. Her letters apparently circulated and admired long after her death for their elegance and intelligence, though sadly none survive intact for us to judge for ourselves. Sulpicia, writing perhaps a generation or two before our story tonight, left behind a small handful of genuinely personal love poems, one of the only surviving bodies of Latin poetry we can attribute with real confidence to a woman's own hand rather than a man's voice ventriloquizing female emotion for his own poetic purposes. A distinction that matters more than it might first sound, since so much of what Roman literature tells us about women's inner lives actually comes filtered entirely through male authorship, however sympathetically or unsympathetically rendered. I think this particular gap, the near total absence of women's own direct written voice surviving from this entire era, deserves to be named plainly before we close tonight's story, because it shapes everything else we have discussed without most of it ever announcing itself directly. Nearly every source behind tonight's narration, Juvenal's satire, Pliny's anecdotes, Ovid's complaints about cruel mistresses and careless hairdressers, the legal texts describing tutela and inheritance, every single one of them comes from a man's pen, observing women from the outside, often with real hostility, occasionally with real affection, but never from within. Valeria herself, and the version of her mourning we have spent tonight imagining in such close, careful detail, is necessarily a reconstruction, built from genuine fragments, real archaeology, real legal texts, real satire, and real graffiti, but assembled in the end by guesswork bridging gaps that the actual historical record simply leaves open and silent. That is not a flaw in tonight's story so much as it is an honest description of what working with ancient history actually requires: humility about how much we can never fully recover, alongside genuine confidence about the patterns we can responsibly reconstruct from what does survive. Motherhood, more than almost anything else, organized the deeper architecture of a Roman woman's social value and her own sense of purpose within her world, in ways that are worth understanding gently rather than clinically, because the stakes involved were genuinely high in a society without modern medicine to soften them. Childbirth carried real and serious danger for both mother and infant, and Roman households marked it with elaborate ritual, precisely because the outcome was never something anyone could simply take for granted. A pregnant woman was surrounded by amulets, prayers to specific protective deities, and the careful attendance of midwives, obstetresses, who carried genuine practical skill passed down through apprenticeship and experience even without anything resembling formal medical training in the way we understand it now. Some of these midwives clearly developed real expertise, and the physician Soranus, writing not long after this period, left behind a detailed treatise on gynecology that drew heavily on the practical knowledge these women had accumulated, suggesting a level of professional respect that occasionally crossed the usual lines, separating recognized medicine from women's traditional knowledge. The ius trium liberorum we mentioned earlier, that legal exemption from guardianship granted to mothers of 3 or more children, existed for a reason beyond simple administrative convenience. It reflected, however imperfectly, a genuine state interest in honoring and incentivizing the very real risk and labor that childbearing represented, an acknowledgement, even if a narrowly transactional one, that a woman who had survived multiple pregnancies and raised multiple children to a meaningful age had contributed something the state considered worth real legal recognition. Valeria herself, in the version of her life we have imagined tonight, has 2 children, a son nearing the age where he will soon take up the toga virilis and step formally into Roman adult male citizenship, and a younger daughter who will in time go through her own version of the mourning ritual we described in such detail earlier, learning the hairstyles, the cosmetics, the careful calculations of status and modesty that shaped every visible inch of a respectable Roman woman's appearance. There is something quietly moving, I think, in imagining that continuity stretching forward, a daughter who will someday sit on the same low stool, having her own hair pulled into whatever style happens to be fashionable a decade or 2 from now, learning the same essential lessons about jewelry and perfume and which colors a married woman is permitted to wear, inheriting not just her mother's pearls, but her mother's entire inherited understanding of exactly how much space a respectable Roman woman was allowed to occupy in the world, and exactly where, on any given afternoon, she would be required to sit. There is one more layer of this afternoon worth understanding properly before we let the story finally close, because the matches Valeria watched were not, as a modern audience might assume, simply men fighting in some generic, interchangeable fashion. Roman gladiatorial combat operated according to a genuinely elaborate system of distinct fighter classes, each one carrying its own equipment, its own fighting style, and its own particular fan following. And learning to read these differences was, for someone like Valeria who attended regularly, a real and meaningful form of expertise, not unlike the kind of detailed knowledge a devoted sports fan today might carry about positions, formations, and playing styles within a single game. Her favourite, the retiarius, fought with comparatively light protection, a simple loincloth, an arm guard, sometimes a shoulder piece, relying instead on speed, a weighted net meant to entangle an opponent, and a long trident for striking from a distance once the net had done its work. Facing him in the arena would typically be a secutor, heavily armoured by comparison, helmeted with a smooth, rounded surface specifically designed to avoid giving the net anything to catch on, carrying a large shield and a short sword, built for close, brutal engagement rather than the retiarius's preferred distance and speed. The contrast itself was the entire appeal of pairing these 2 types together, a fast, lightly armoured fighter against a slower, heavily protected one, each style carrying genuine advantages and genuine vulnerabilities that made the outcome of any given match feel real rather than predetermined. Other classes filled out the broader roster Valeria would have recognized instantly. The Murmelo, armoured with a distinctive fish-crested helmet and a tall rectangular shield reminiscent of legionary equipment, often paired against a Thrakes lighter and more mobile, carrying a small, curved shield and a distinctively angled short sword associated, at least in origin, with Thracian fighting traditions from the northern Balkans. There was the equally specialised Hoplomachus, equipped in a style borrowed loosely from Greek hoplite warfare, and on rarer, more theatrical occasions, the Anderbatter, fighting blindfolded inside a closed helmet for reasons that ancient sources treat as straightforwardly comic rather than tragic, a pairing apparently included specifically to make a crowd laugh at the sheer chaotic clumsiness of 2 men swinging blindly at each other without any ability to see. Each pairing, each match, was chosen deliberately by the editor of the games to balance spectacle with genuine athletic interest, and a regular attendee built up, over years of watching, a real and detailed vocabulary for evaluating what she saw. Valeria could tell you, if you asked her, exactly why a particular secutor's helmet design gave him a narrower field of vision, and therefore a specific vulnerability a clever retiarius might exploit. She could tell you which Mamillo, currently fighting for the most prominent training school in the city, the Ludus, had the best record this season, and which Thrax was rumoured to be nursing an injury that might affect his footwork in his next appearance. This is not trivial fan enthusiasm, exactly, or rather it is exactly that, but it is also a genuine sophisticated body of practical knowledge, accumulated and shared the same way any devoted audience accumulates expertise about anything they care about deeply enough to watch closely, year after year, fight after fight. There is also worth mentioning briefly the question of how a respectable woman like Valeria was even able to attend something like this in the first place without scandal attaching itself to the outing, since Roman propriety placed real, if somewhat flexible, expectations on unaccompanied female movement through public space. Married women of established households generally attended with at least the loose social cover of household slaves accompanying them, exactly as Valeria's own litter-bearers provided, and the games themselves, as a sanctioned, enormous, almost universally attended civic event, carried none of the impropriety that an unmarried young woman wandering the forum alone after dark might have invited. Unmarried daughters typically attended in the company of mothers, aunts, or other married female relatives rather than entirely alone, a kind of informal chaperoning that protected reputation without requiring anything as restrictive as the seclusion practiced elsewhere in the ancient world. The games, in this narrow sense, functioned as one of the genuinely accepted, fully respectable public spaces where Roman women of nearly every age and status could be seen attending without inviting the kind of gossip that might follow them almost anywhere else in the city. It is worth pausing, too, on the smaller, more personal tools women carried with them into that brutal upper-tier heat, because these objects tell their own quiet story about ingenuity operating within a system that offered women almost no architectural relief from the sun. Folding fans made from thin wood, ivory, or stiffened papyrus, stretched with painted linen or feathers, were common accessories among women who could afford them, worked steadily through the long afternoon to push at least some moving air across an overheated face. Wealthier women sometimes brought small parasols as well, portable sunshades held by an attendant or by the woman herself, though their usefulness this high up, exposed to wind as much as sun, was limited at best, more a gesture toward comfort than a genuine solution to it. Small clay or glass bottles of scented water, dabbed at the wrists and temples, offered another brief, fleeting relief, the floral or citrus scent cutting, if only for a moment, through the thick, animal-crowded smell that settled over the upper tier by mid-afternoon. Sweat and dust and the lingering trace of whatever had happened on the sand below mixing together into something no amount of perfume could fully erase. Valeria's own fan, a modest piece of painted wood that had belonged to her mother before her, moved steadily through her hand for most of the afternoon without her really thinking about it, the kind of automatic, half-conscious motion that becomes its own form of rest precisely because it requires no attention at all. Flavia has no fan of her own, and at some point in the early afternoon, almost without either woman commenting on it directly, they begin sharing it, passing it back and forth in roughly the same easy rhythm as the shared cup of wine, a small, wordless act of generosity that neither woman would have thought twice about, and that neither almost certainly remembered as anything remarkable by the time she fell asleep that night. And then there is the matter of simply being seen, which mattered in Roman social life in ways that can be easy to underestimate from this distance, because attendance at the games functioned, for women across every level of this hierarchy, as its own kind of social currency, separate from and sometimes more valuable than the actual content of what happened on the sand. A woman's presence, her dress, the company she kept, the section she occupied, all of it became material for conversation at dinners and social calls for days afterward, woven into the same gossip economy that tracked marriages, dowries, scandals, and reputations across the entire city. Did you see what she wore today? Did you notice she sat with so-and-so? Did you hear who she was seen speaking with near the gates? These were not idle questions in Roman social life. They were, in their own way, a genuine mechanism of social accountability, an informal but powerful system through which reputation was built, maintained or quietly dismantled, conversation by conversation, observation by observation, almost entirely independent of any law or formal institution. This is, in its own way, one more piece of the larger puzzle we have been assembling all night. The games were never simply entertainment, not for anyone in that building, and certainly not for the women forced to the very top of it. They were also a stage, a marketplace of visibility, a place where status was displayed, tested, occasionally challenged, and almost always, in the end, quietly reinforced. Valeria's careful mourning, the hours spent on hair and cosmetics, and the precise selection of which earrings to wear, was never really about the games themselves, not entirely. It was about being seen attending them, dressed exactly as a woman of her standing was expected to be dressed, performing a version of herself that the watching city would recognize, approve of, and in its own quiet way continue to permit. Extravagance, in this light, was never simply indulgence for its own sake. It was a kind of social insurance, a visible demonstration of a household's continued wealth and standing, paid for daily in hours of preparation and the steady accumulating cost of pearls, perfume, dye, and imported scent, performed in front of an audience that was always, whether anyone admitted it openly or not, quietly taking notes. There is one final thread worth pulling on before we let this story close properly, because we have spent so much of tonight describing individual objects: a pearl earring, a vial of myrrh, a stola trimmed in purple, without always pausing to notice just how far each of those objects had travelled before it ever reached a Roman woman's jewellery box or wardrobe chest. A wealthy household like Valeria's functioned, in a very real sense, as the final destination point for trade networks stretching across almost the entire known world of her era, and her morning toilette, however ordinary it felt to her, was quietly assembled from the accumulated reach of an empire that had organized itself, in part, around delivering exactly this kind of luxury to exactly this kind of household. Silk arrived from far beyond the empire's eastern frontier, travelling overland through Parthian territory, along routes that connected, eventually, all the way back to looms in distant China, passing through so many intermediary hands and markets along the way that the Romans themselves had only the vaguest, most garbled understanding of where it actually originated, some imagining it grew on trees, others believing it came from some strange insect whose true nature nobody in the Mediterranean world had ever actually witnessed firsthand. By the time a length of silk reached a Roman market, its price had been driven up so dramatically by the sheer number of merchants taking their cut along the way, that the elder Pliny, writing with his usual mixture of fascination and moral disapproval, complained bitterly about the staggering quantity of Roman gold flowing eastward every single year, simply to satisfy this one particular appetite, money that in his telling vanished permanently out of the empire's economy in exchange for what he considered, with the dry disdain of a man who clearly did not have to do without it, a fundamentally frivolous fabric. Pepper and other spices travelled an even longer route, carried by sea across the Indian Ocean, riding the seasonal monsoon winds that sailors had learned, through generations of accumulated practical knowledge, to use deliberately rather than simply endure, departing Roman Egypt at one part of the year and returning at another, timed precisely to the wind's predictable reversal. These spices flavoured food in wealthy households, certainly, but they also found their way into medicine, into perfume, into the kind of small daily luxuries that simply would not have existed in Rome at all without an extraordinarily long and complex chain of ships, ports, intermediary traders, and accumulated maritime knowledge stretching all the way from the Malabar coast of India back to the docks Valeria's own litter passed on its way toward the amphitheatre that very morning. Ivory came down from sub-Saharan Africa, passing through North African ports before crossing the Mediterranean, eventually carved by skilled artisans into hairpins, small decorative boxes, the handles of mirrors and combs, another material whose true point of origin most Romans who actually owned it had never given a single moment's serious thought. Amber, by contrast, travelled the opposite direction entirely, carried down out of the Baltic region along an ancient overland route, sometimes called the Amber Road, prized for its warm golden colour and the strange, genuinely mysterious way it seemed to hold static electricity when rubbed. a property Roman writers noted with real curiosity, even though they had no framework whatsoever for actually explaining it. I find myself, when I really sit with this particular thread, genuinely struck by what it means that a single Roman matron's ordinary morning routine, the kind of routine repeated with only minor variation in thousands of households across the city on any given day, quietly summoned together threads from China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, and the cold Baltic coastline, all converging in one small room where a slave girl pinned curls into place by lamplight before dawn. None of the women in that room would have framed it in those terms. To them it was simply what getting ready looked like, the ordinary texture of being a woman of means in the wealthiest, most far-reaching city the world had yet produced. But there is something worth noticing in it anyway. The way empire at its most basic and intimate level is not really made of armies and treaties and the grand political maneuvering that fills most history books. It is made of small rooms and small daily choices and the quiet, almost invisible accumulation of objects that travelled astonishing distances simply to end up resting for one ordinary morning against the skin of one ordinary woman getting ready to watch a spectacle she had seen many times before and would in all likelihood see many times again. It is worth knowing, before we let Valeria finally rest, that a day like this one did not arrive constantly, and that scarcity itself was part of what made it feel so significant. By the later 1st century, organized public games filled a substantial number of days across the Roman calendar, but they were tied to specific festivals, anniversaries, and the particular generosity of whichever wealthy sponsor happened to be funding a given set of events, rather than occurring with the predictable year-round regularity that modern sporting calendars offer us now. A games day was an occasion, anticipated for weeks beforehand once the announcement went up, discussed at length over dinners and morning visits, the specific gladiators scheduled to appear becoming a genuine citywide topic of conversation in the days leading up to it, not unlike the build-up before any major event people circle on a calendar months in advance. That anticipation matters, I think, because it shaped the emotional weight of the day itself. This was not background noise in Valeria's week. It was the thing the entire week had been quietly building toward, the reason she had been keeping half an ear out, for days now, for any news about which fighters might appear and which animals had reportedly arrived at the holding pens near the building, brought in from ports along the coast amid considerable local excitement among anyone who happened to glimpse the crates being unloaded. And now that anticipation has fully resolved itself into memory, the way every long-awaited day eventually does, settling from something bright and electric into something quieter, already beginning the slow process of becoming simply one more day among many, recalled later mostly in fragments, a particular match, a particular cup of shared wine, a particular view of the city from a height she rarely visited otherwise. That too is worth noticing, the way even the most carefully prepared, most anxiously anticipated days eventually fold themselves down into something small enough to carry, a handful of specific images surviving out of hours and hours of heat and noise and crowd, the rest simply allowed to fade, the way most of any life eventually does, regardless of which century happens to be doing the living. Outside, far past the walls of Valeria's quiet house, Rome itself has gone properly dark now, the kind of dark that only existed before gas lamps and electric light ever entered the picture, a darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of a torch carried by some night watchman making his slow round, or the dim glow leaking out from beneath a shuttered doorway where someone, somewhere, is still awake for reasons of their own. The streets that carried so much noise and motion this morning have thinned down to almost nothing, just the irregular rhythm of footsteps somewhere distant, a dog answering another dog somewhere across a few rooftops, the particular hush that settles over any city, ancient or modern, once enough of its people have finally gone to sleep. The amphitheatre itself sits empty under the stars, that enormous pale curve of stone holding nothing now but silence and the cooling night air moving slowly through tier after empty tier. It is strange to think about if you let yourself sit with it for a moment, Hours earlier, this exact space held 50,000 human voices layered into one continuous roar, thousands of separate private dramas, Valeria's quiet fondness for a fighter whose actual name she may never learn, Flavia's first genuine glimpse of a lion, the Empress watching from her shaded box, the senators below arguing quietly among themselves about politics that had nothing to do with the games at all. Now there is nothing on that sand but raked, settling dust, nothing in those stands but cooling stone, and somewhere far beneath the floor in the hypogeum, the animals not used today shifting restlessly in their cages, waiting, the way everything in that building eventually waits, for the next morning when the gates will open again and the entire elaborate performance will begin once more. Fresh sand, fresh crowds, fresh hierarchies sorting themselves automatically into their assigned tiers the moment the first body steps through the first gate. I keep thinking even now about that detail we started with, the one about Valeria's mourning and everything it cost in time and labour and care, set against the simple, unbending fact that none of it brought her a single seat closer to the action than the freed woman walking beside her on the stairs. There is something genuinely useful, I think, in carrying a detail like that with you a little while after the story itself has ended. Not as outrage exactly, more as a kind of quiet, ongoing curiosity about all the other invisible architectures sorting us, even now, into categories we did not choose and cannot always see clearly from the inside. Rome built its hierarchy into marble, numbered gates and stone tiers, visible to anyone willing to look up and count the levels. Most hierarchies are not so obliging. Most of them hide in places we never think to look at all. But that is a thought for tomorrow maybe, or for whenever you happen to wake up and find this particular train of thought drifting back through your mind unannounced. Tonight there is only this. A city settling into sleep around one ordinary, extraordinary woman who climbed too many stairs, watched her favourite fighter win, shared a cup of wine with a stranger she will probably never see again, and came home tired in exactly the satisfying way a long, full day tends to leave a person. Her hair is loose now, spread across the pillow the way it looked before anyone ever touched it with a heated iron. Her face is bare, lined faintly at the eyes, entirely her own. Somewhere down the hall, her children sleep too, unaware of anything except the simple fact that their mother went out today and came home again, the way she always does. The lamp in her room has gone out completely now, the last thin curl of smoke from its wick dissolving somewhere up near the ceiling into nothing at all. Outside, the stars continue their slow, unhurried turn above a city that has seen empires rise inside its walls and will, eventually, though nobody sleeping tonight has any reason to suspect it yet, see this very building outlast every single person who filled its seats today, standing for thousands of years after the last gladiator has fought his last match, after the last woman has climbed her last flight of stairs to the very top tier, after Rome itself has changed so completely that almost nothing about Valeria's ordinary Tuesday would be recognizable to anyone walking those same streets now. And yet here we are, somehow, still telling her story, still climbing those stairs with her, in our own way 2,000 years later, in the dark, half asleep, halfway across whatever distance separates your bed from that long-vanished bedroom in a city that does not exist anymore in the form she knew it. That is, I think, its own small, quiet kind of magic, the way a single ordinary day, invented and reconstructed from fragments and guesswork and genuine care, can still reach all the way across that distance and land somewhere as soft and as real as wherever you happen to be lying right now. Sleep well. Rome is quiet tonight, and so, for now, are we.